When she felt her trailing leg hit a hurdle during the 80-meter semifinals, she would have known almost instantly that for her, the Olympics were over. Any athlete in that situation would feel crushing disappointment, but her journey had come with some added pressure. A few extra hurdles, if you'll pardon the pun. This was only the third Olympics at which women were allowed to compete in track and field at all, and many sports officials still fretted over the damage female athletes must certainly be doing to their delicate internal organs. And then there was her race. While she and another black woman had qualified to compete 4 years earlier for Team USA, they were both instead named alternates for the 1932 Games, losing their spots to women with objectively weaker performances. That hurt. The racism they faced from their own white teammates hurt, and the irony of receiving better treatment in Hitler's Berlin than back home in the country she represented as an Olympian, that hurt too. But the pain of a broken foot and with it the loss of a chance to medal, that she could handle. Because as soon as the starting gun went off and she took that first step, she had already made history. Today is August 5th, 2025, and on this day in 1936, 22-year-old Theodora Ann Tidye Pickett became the first black woman to compete for the United States in track and field at the Olympics. I'm your host, Running Up That Hillary, and you are listening to Today in Running History. It is once again Tattoo Day, which means that today's episode is sponsored by my race tats. These are the temporary tattoos with motivational sayings that I wear for all of my races. July was actually the first time in years that I went an entire calendar month without at least a half marathon on the schedule, and I did not like it at all. So I signed up for the Dragon's Den Half Marathon here in San Antonio this upcoming Saturday. The high that day is 93, and with humidity, the feels like will be over 100 degrees, so I am expecting it to be a tough and very slow race. There is not much I can do about the physical aspects of racing in Texas in August, but at least I will be wearing a tattoo from my race tats to help with the mental part. My favorite mantra for races this time of year is forward is a pace, because literally, no one PRs when it's 90 degrees and 80% humidity, but what truly matters is continuing to move forward toward the finish line and toward cooler weather in a couple of months. The best part about my race tats is that they are completely sweat-proof, which is so important this time of year. Guys, I ran Grandma's Marathon back in June, and it took me more than 4.5 hours. It was nearly 90 degrees by the time I finished, and I was so sweaty that it looked like I had jumped into Lake Superior. But the My Race Tats mantra tattoo on my inner wrist was absolutely pristine, and I know that the one I wear this weekend will be the same. Check out my race tats in the link in the episode description. And as always, listeners of Today in Running History can save 20% by using my code Hillary at checkout. Okay, guys, so I am so excited to talk to y'all about Tidye Pickett today. This is a story that honestly should be much more well known because it's a huge milestone in both Black history and women's history, and honestly, just general American history as well. A couple episodes back, I told y'all about this book that I read earlier in the year that had a profound effect on me. It's called Better, Faster, Farther by Maggie Mertens, and it tells the stories of many of the women who paved the way for what women's running looks like today. On August 2nd, I was joined by Maggie Mertens to discuss the 1928 Women's Olympic 800-meter race that resulted in the event being banned until 1960, and I highly recommend going back to listen to that one as well if y'all have not done so already. But I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Maggie back to Today in Running History to talk about Louise Stokes and Tidye Pickett, the first two Black women to qualify for the Olympics in track, how their chance to compete was snatched away in 1932, and how Pickett finally became the first Black American woman to compete in a track and field event at the 1936 Olympics. All right, I have Maggie Mertens on once again. She is the author of Better, Faster, Farther, and she was actually on just 3 days ago when we talked about the 1928 women's 800-meter final. If y'all have not listened to that episode, please go back and listen because that one is great as well. How are you doing, Maggie?
Doing great, thanks.
Awesome. So we are here to talk about Tidye Pickett and the 1936 Olympics. But before we can get into those, let's go back to 1932 and the Olympics that year were in Los Angeles. Now, at this point, there were two women who were part of the story. This was Tidye Pickett and Louise Stokes. Can you tell us about how the Olympic trials that year went out and how the two of them ended up making history just at that point?
Yeah, definitely. So 1932 was only the second Olympic Games that women were running in track events. In 28, the team for the United States had been, entirely white women. And then in 1932, you had Tidye Pickett and Louise Stokes, who actually qualified for the Olympics as the first two Black American women to qualify for the team. They qualified not in the 100-meter race or in the 80-meter hurdles, but they qualified actually as part of the relay team pool. So they both in the Olympic trials. Uh, Louise, I believe, came in fourth in the 100-meter race, and Tidye Pickett came in sixth. And so, because of those finish times, they were brought along with the team to be part of this relay pool.
And how are they received by the rest of the American Olympic women within the track community?
So it's interesting. For the most part, from what these women have, left behind in their memories, most of it was okay. Of course, it was an extremely racist and still segregated society that they were coming from. And at least one member of the Olympic team, Babe Didrikson, was known to be pretty overtly racist and actually, was very unkind to Tidye and Louise. But even beyond the like overt racism of Babe Didrikson, there were times out on their way across the country to LA where, they were not invited to team dinners or to stay with the rest of the team in certain hotels because they were Black and because they were going through segregated states and maybe the dining room was whites only or maybe that hotel was whites only. So they were, obviously going through a very different experience than their white teammates were.
And even the train, they stayed in separate areas.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. They had their own separate car.
Wow. So eventually the whole team gets to Los Angeles and the games begin. And they're obviously with for the 4 by 100, there are heats. And so what happened in those qualifying heats with Louise and Tidye?
Oh, well, in those heats, they were not chosen to run in any of them. So there was actually a lot of attention on them. Some people kind of said that, of course, like when you're putting a relay team together, it's all about, the chemistry between them, but also, who's fresh, who's good at handoffs, who's good at sprinting, all of these things. Did you tire yourself out in another event already? All of that. But these two were fresh and they were great athletes and yeah, they were left off. Even though, they were written down in some of these, many of the newspaper articles said that they kind of assumed that they would be on the relay team, at least in some of these heats. But they never ran. They weren't allowed to take the track.
And was an excuse ever given, or was it just a nope, not running?
Coaches said that they made the best decision for the event, and that there were other girls who were better at the handoff or better at the kick, and those were kind of the excuses given. What was interesting is the at the time there were kind of Black newspapers, and then there were the everyone else's newspapers. And the Black newspapers were all very up in arms that this was a race-based decision.
Yeah, I can imagine because it obviously was. So
Yeah.
I can imagine that they would be because I mean, it was a big deal that they were going to the Olympics at all and kind of a slap in the face that they get all that way and then don't even run even in the qualifying heats. So
No, yeah.
at least someone called it out. At least there's some written accounts of someone calling them out. All right, so the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles are over and everyone returns home. And what did everything look like for Louise Stokes and Tidye Pickett following those Olympic Games?
They looked good. In a lot of ways, they continued on in their training. And they had this, thing on their record now that they had at least gone to the Olympics. And they were really given um I think they both really had a chip on their shoulder, of course. They wanted to prove themselves. And Tidye Pickett in particular, she'd been really young at the 32 games, and I think she was 18, maybe even. And so by 36, she had really, really improved, and she was really at the top of her game.
That's awesome. And so both women ended up going to the US Olympic trials that year in New York City. And let's talk about how that played out because this was a little bit different than the relay pool.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, Tidye Pickett ended up qualifying not just for the pool, but she also got second place in the 80-meter hurdles um, event. And so she was able to qualify for that outright. And she also qualified for the 100-meter race. So she was going then as a qualifier in all three women's running events.
Wow. That's fantastic. And that's kind of too much for them to come up with a reason for her not to run at that point, it sounds like.
Exactly, exactly.
And then Louise Stokes, she did very well in the heats during the trials, and then she ended up not not making it in any of the individual events, but she did once again make the relay pool.
That's right. That's right. So it was again, it was kind of a replay in that they were the two black women who had qualified for the team, and they were headed to the Olympics in 36.
And this time, because I guess commercial flights weren't a huge thing yet, they took a boat
Mhm.
from the US over to Europe. And what did that journey look like for them?
Well, yeah, the entire Olympic team, actually the Olympic US team, I think except for there was one team, I think it was like the men's swimming and diving team got to fly, but everyone else was on this giant boat that had to cross the ocean. And of course, given that it was 1936, it was also segregated. So you had all of the black athletes, including like Jesse Owens and all of these famous men who were in, cabins that were away from the white athletes, and were supposedly not in as great shape, like not in as great place. There were a lot of newspaper reports at the time about seasickness and that a lot of people were seasick, which I mean, as you can imagine, if you've ever been
Oh,
on a boat
yeah.
on the ocean, like it can be very terrible. And it was very strange for me as a reporter because in a lot of these articles, it talked about that, it was mostly the black athletes who were seasick because they were like not as good at being on the water, supposedly. So that is like just an example of like
I
the
mean, if they were
overt.
given the crappier cabins, I would imagine that would have
Yes,
something to do with it, like where they were
exactly.
positioned and all that. I don't know anything about boats, but that I would assume that that probably had a lot more to do with it than anything else.
Yeah, yeah. So it's just like overt racism, of course, that they're experiencing, not only just in life, but even on this boat ride over as Olympians.
And I cannot imagine that that got much better because they were going to Nazi Germany. And so and that just blows my mind. Like the fact that the 1936 Olympics happened at all and that it was in Nazi Germany and in front of Hitler and all this was going on. Like it just blows my
Yes.
mind that any of this, and it shouldn't. None of this should surprise me anymore. But it still does. What was their experience once they got to Berlin?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, there was a lot of resistance and calls for boycott for this Olympics. Of course, people kind of saw what was happening in Nazi Germany, beginning to happen, and even at the time, like they weren't allowed, like they took out Germany itself, removed several Jewish members of the German Olympic team, from being allowed to compete. It turned out the United States was doing the same thing.
Yep. Tune in
And
in 3 days and we will talk about that. August 8th episode. We will get more into that.
And, so you had this contingent who was really like, we should not be going over there. We should call for a boycott. Well, a lot of again, like the black newspapers were saying, actually, we should go because this is like our opportunity to be on this world stage. Jesse Owens and men like that were like really raising this profile of Black Americans by being, someone that kind of brought the country together and that everyone could root for. And so there was sort of a divide, in terms of whether we should go, whether we shouldn't. And what was interesting to read about was that Tidye and Louise actually didn't find Nazi Germany to be racist at all, in comparison to the United States. They actually felt like they were treated fairly well by the Olympic committee and the people who were there to kind of put on the games. And I think that says a lot just about, how bad racism was in
Yeah,
the
I was
United
about to say, I
States.
think that says less about Germany and just more about like their day to day, how bad it was. Like
Yes. Yes.
wow.
Well, and the propaganda the Nazi Germany was putting on just
Yeah.
about like how well they were doing and what a great country they were building.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a whole other conversation. But I mean, it all things considered, I'm glad that they didn't have a terrible time personally. That is good to hear.
Yes.
And so Tidye Pickett had qualified as an individual, and so even if they wanted to at that point, there wasn't really a slick way to get her to not compete. And it would have been hurting the United States as well at that point. And so on August 5th of 1936, she became the first American Black woman to compete at the Olympics.
That's right. That's right. She started in the 80-meter hurdles. That was her first event that came up. And I think they started with the semifinals because it was a new event. So, there weren't that many women that were doing it. So this was the first heat, but it was also the semifinals, that she was running in. And it took kind of a tragic turn, unfortunately, because on her second hurdle, she had this habit of kind of trailing her back foot and kind of grazing over the top of that hurdle. And these hurdles were not as flexible or lightweight as the ones she was used to. And actually, when she hit her foot on that hurdle, she broke it, and so she was unable to, finish the competition, to get a medal, to compete in her other two events that she probably would have also been running in. And it was pretty tragic, but she did make history just by taking that track.
Wow. And then, so the 4x100, a couple days later, obviously she was injured. She was not in the pool anymore. Tell us what happened with Louise Stokes.
Yeah. Well, again, pretty sadly, Tidye was obviously heartbroken, and she had spoken with Louise, and she said, you have to do this for me now. Like, we need to get a medal and prove what we're worth here. And once again, Louise was left off. She was not chosen to run, and so she did not get to participate once again, and she did not get to win that first medal for the Black American women.
Wow. So Tidye made history, but her race did not go well, and then Louise was once again not able to compete. What
No.
did life look like for the two of them when they returned to America and for the remainder of their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a moment that they were proud to have been the first two Black American women Olympians. But I think it was also a point of sadness for both of them, right? Like this was real tragedy. And of course, after this, World War II breaks out and, there isn't an Olympic Games for another 14 years. And so by the time we have the next Olympic Games in 48, um, what's really interesting is that running had really turned in the United States to be far, I guess, less accepted by white America, but more accepted by Black America. And I think Tidye and Louise probably had something to do with that. And so by the time the 48 Olympics came around, you actually did have a majority Black women's track and field team, which is pretty incredible, and did open the gates for, those first medals.
And it blows my mind just to think about track without Black women. Like that just is
Yes.
insane. Like just, thinking about track, it's such a diverse group. If you look at any track event, and especially in sprinting as well, like I just can't imagine these races being put on. And again, I'm not a historian, so so much of this is new to me. I should stop being surprised by any of this. Because I went to high school, so at the very least I know that much stuff, but it's just crazy in 2025 to picture less than 100 years ago, less than 90 years ago, that Black American women were not only not dominating these events, but not part of them at all. And
Yeah,
so
exactly.
it's pretty great that Tidye and Louise were able to kind of kickstart that entire process and everything.
Yeah, no, they were incredible.
And before we get off, is there anything else about those games, about the two women, or anything else that you want to make sure that our audience hears?
I think they're just a really great example of how we put, constrictions on ourselves and on society of what we think people can do based on what they look like, or their sex or their gender or their race, any of that, when we have these assumptions where we think we know what someone can do, and then we just change them 20 years later, so the team looks totally different. I think it's just proof that we really can't make those judgments, based on what anyone looks like.
Awesome. And that's great to remember now as well, because even if things aren't as overt, it's still something that everybody needs to keep top of mind. And I would definitely nobody would say that everything is 100% perfect at this point either.
Definitely not.
Well, thank you again, Maggie, for coming back on the show just 3 days later.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me, Hillary.
Thanks. Thank you so much to Maggie Mertens for joining us again. I could not recommend her book, Better, Faster, Farther, more highly. I will include a link for all of y'all to check it out in the episode description. And that is all I have for y'all today. Thank you so much for continuing to tune in. As always, please make sure to like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on alerts, send to everyone in your running club, and then join me tomorrow as we head to 1958 to hear about the Golden Mile, which led to 5 men breaking 4 minutes for the first time in history. I'm your host, Running Up That Hillary, and this has been Today in Running History. 4 years earlier for Team earlier. All right, and then here's the interview. Hey, Maggie. Oh, hi. Thanks for coming back. Oh, yeah, you're welcome. This is really cool. Oh, all right. Wow, that was great. Do 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 do. Here's the outro. Wow, I think that was like a new PR. I mean, I messed up a little bit, but like I really didn't screw up too much that time. New PR. All right.